Well, thanks everybody for taking time out this afternoon to allow us to present some information on refrigerant and the changes that you'll see in the upcoming years. As Nicole said, my name's Jeff Warther. I have been in the industry for a long time, my entire career. So I started out as a technician with the Kroger company, and then it just, like I say, I've been in the industry my entire career. So dealing a lot with the refrigerants lately. Actually did a lot when I was with Kroger, but that's a long time ago. So, but yeah, just thanks again for allowing to spend some time today and talk about refrigerants. Now, the first thing when you got the invite, some of you may be asking, who is Chemours? It's a fairly new name. It's only about 5 years old. But if I would mention the word Freon, then everybody gets grounded, right? So Chemours is a spin-off from DuPont. So they took their Freon or refrigerant side, Teflon, titanium. They grouped that into a new organization called Chemours, which is like living chemistry. And so that's where you think of R12, R22, 410A even would be under our Freon brand name. But as we talk about the refrigerants moving forward, it's going to be under what we call the Opteon refrigerant name. So trying to balance or get that optimum balance between performance, environmental impact, price, all those kind of things come into play whenever you're trying to design around a new refrigerant. So if you're familiar with the word Freon, we hope that very soon you'll get comfortable and know the word Opteon, because we've got some really good products as we move forward into the refrigerant changes. So before I get started on the refrigerants, I really just wanted to ground everybody. These are two terms that tend to get thrown around quite a bit, ODP versus GWP. And so really, as we move forward, this GWP, or what we call global warming potential, is going to become critical. So one of the key things that I'd like for you to get out of this webinar is really, it's just going to be about what is the GWP of that refrigerant. And so if you work in other segments other than, say, air conditioning, maybe you work in commercial refrigeration segments, it's going to be all about the global warming potential. But like I say, sometimes ODP gets mixed in there, and they're two different things. So I just wanted to ground everybody in this presentation before we go much deeper. So ozone depletion potential, that is what the Montreal Protocol was all about, all the way back in 1987. They recognized that refrigerants that had chlorine, or one of these C's in here is chlorine, and when the refrigerant would accidentally get released into the atmosphere, that chlorine would attack the ozone, and you would hear that the ozone hole was getting very big. Well, if you talked with people recently, the ozone hole is actually shrinking, which is good, which means that everyone's doing their part in eliminating CFCs like R12, or, like say, if you tried to get a jug of R22 lately, as of last year, that was the end. We couldn't manufacture any more new R22. So if you're buying some refrigerant R22, you may be getting some R22 that was pre-purchased, or it may be a reclaimed R22 refrigerant. But it's all about phasing these refrigerants out, because you need a thin layer of ozone over the Earth's atmosphere to protect from the sun's harmful rays. Skin cancer, cataracts, things like that are phase out refrigerants. That's associated with ozone depletion, or ODP. Now, the next one is global warming potential. And so what this does is, actually, as the refrigerants leak into the atmosphere, the sun's rays come in, but then this global warming potential actually creates a blanket. And it's kind of like these two seem like they'd fight. Why don't we just leave a little hole in the ozone and the GWP refrigerant stuff would go out? It doesn't work that way. So what we have to do, though, is work to phase down. So those of you that are dealing with R410A, maybe 407C or something like that. These refrigerants will be a phase down, not a phase out. So you'll see the Kigali Amendment. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But that was actually introduced in 2016, and it's to help reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. So, like I say, the good analogy is like, you leave your service fan closed up with all the windows up. The heat comes in, but it's not got any way to get out until you open that door. And so it becomes this delicate balance of, the ozone depletion closing up that hole, but then we've got to get the refrigerants to break down. And that's what all about a GWP, or a global warming potential, is about. And I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So ODP, any of those refrigerants that have ODP will be phased out. Things with GDP, we got to get the lowest global warming potential value that we can for each one of the segments, whether it's car air conditioner or house air conditioning, comfort cooling, maybe commercial refrigeration. It's all going to be about GWP. So this is just a quick analogy. Like I said, R12, R22, they had ozone depletion potentials. And so that's what the Montreal Protocol took care of. And you can see all these refrigerants below that have a 0 ODP. So I've been in the industry long enough, and I actually worked for a major equipment OEM. And in the mid-90s, they introduced R410A as the refrigerant choice against R22. Now, some people would argue that, wait a minute, we got rid of the ODP, which was a good thing because it was harming the ozone layer, but we actually went up in a GWP value. And like I say, if you think about R410A, it was introduced in the mid-90s, you need to go back almost 10 years as equipment manufacturers started looking at R410A. So R410A has actually been in the industry for almost 30 years, if you think about that. But the one downside of this was that it had a higher GWP. And so here we are today talking about new refrigerants that will eventually replace R410A. And the two top candidates are R454B and R32. And I'll explain some differences why certain OEMs are selecting ones versus the other. But bottom line, this is a win-win. It has no ozone depletion, and it has some of the lowest GWP, or global warming potential values, for each segment. So like I say, we actually have a refrigerant. Global warming potential is actually CO2 equivalence. So CO2 actually has a value of 1. But we actually have a refrigerant, R1234YF, that actually has a GWP of less than 1. So we'll show some of that information here in a few minutes. But bottom line, if you're in the air conditioning segment or sector, that's all you do, as far as your business is, these will become the top two candidates moving forward, R454B and R32. Now, I talked about that GWP. This is where that value is going to come in with all these refrigerant regulations. So I talked about Montreal Protocol. That was the phase out. And then in 2016, the Kigali Amendment was ratified, and that is a phase down of HFCs like R410A. Most of you know that the United States and some other countries have yet to ratify the Kigali Amendment. I think it's somewhere around 120 countries have already done it. But the previous administration said, we don't believe in the Kigali Amendment. There's just some different things. So what actually happened, and this was really good, this is one of the good things that came out of 2020 as far as federal. Both Congress, House, and the President agreed on something called the AIM Act, and it was the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. This was all signed, like I say, I think the President signed it like December 27th. So it was a huge surprise. Guys, this is a great thing, because we want this AIM Act, or a federal phase down, to be in place, because with the absence of that, I'll explain what's going on right now with the absence of the AIM Act. But what this AIM Act did is it gave the EPA, it says, okay, we signed it at the end of last year. EPA, you have roughly 9 months to administer it. You have to show how you're going to phase down HFC usage down 85% over a course of 15 years. That's really what the Kigali Amendment did. It created a timeline. And we do believe that the EPA will utilize something very similar to this Kigali, but just signing Kigali doesn't do anything. It really has to have teeth. And that's what this AIM Act actually does. So the EPA will come out with something towards the end of September because they want it to be effective January 1st of 2022. Because this Kigali Amendment, actually, if you go back and look at it, it was supposed to have a 10% reduction back in 2019. But because the United States did not sign on to the Kigali Amendment, that reduction did not occur. So this is where it'll be very important. If this is a good thing for all the industry, it is a federal phase down. This is exactly what we want. Because I'll show in like a second what's going on in the States. But just to bring you up to speed on something called EPA SNAP rules. So you may not know what a SNAP rule is, but there's been plenty of other ones, and I'll show some slides here in a few minutes. But SNAP rules are basically the equipment OEMs and the refrigerant manufacturers. They go to the EPA and says, hey, we recognize that you're creating a phase down, or in some cases like R22 stuff, a phase out. So here are the refrigerants that we believe are the right choices. And once again, it's a lot of work. The EPA really does do a lot of work to make sure that it is the right choices. But here is a proposed SNAP Rule 23 that we expect to come into play sometime this year. And what this is, you can see this is for the large air conditioning segment, right? And it says that these refrigerants can be substitutes for R410A. Now, you may not recognize a lot of these refrigerants, but all of these refrigerants have under an ASHRAE 34 classification. So ASHRAE standard 34 is how refrigerants go through an apples to apples comparison of toxicity or flammability, just different things. So ASHRAE standard 34, all of these refrigerants have an ASHRAE classification of an A2L. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But these refrigerants will not be backwards compatible. So you won't be able to put these into an existing R410A systems. It will only be new equipment. That design will only be following the latest UL standards. And then there's some additional warning stuff that we'll actually walk through towards the end of this presentation to show you what maybe I believe a RUD or a REAM piece of equipment might look like when it introduces one of these new refrigerants into their equipment. Now, I teased a little bit and I said, the AIM Act was a good thing. We really do want that from a federal perspective, because in the absence of that, the individual states were saying, hey, we've got climate targets that we want to hit. And as you know, for the most part, California, or CARB, which is an acronym for California Air Resource Board, is leading the way. But then there's a lot of states, roughly half the states have joined something called the Climate Alliance. Now, the reason I'm going to show you the information on CARB is because we do believe that the EPA is actually going to follow a very similar guideline and timeline. Once again, that GWP thing I keep talking about, that's where you're going to see here on this next slide. And so what you'll see is they call it sector-based phase down. So they're saying, okay, if it's in the air conditioning sector or air conditioning segment, air conditioning cannot select a refrigerant with a GWP higher than 750. So going back to that earlier slide, you saw that R410A actually has a GWP of roughly 2,000. So starting in 2025 for the residential and light commercial, you cannot put an R410A system into installation in California. You can see actually January 1st of 2023, window units or dehumidifiers or PTAC units actually January 1st of 2023, cannot have a refrigerant with a GWP higher than the 750. So it basically is knocking out R410A. They're saying, we're not telling you what you have to use, but we're just telling you you can't use R410A because it has a GWP of roughly 2000. You can see California said VRS because they're a little more complicated. They're giving them 1 more year. But now what California has done, and we're not quite sure if the EPA is going to do this, but what California says is they originally wanted to do 2023, but because some things like codes and standards weren't all in place, they said, well, we're going to put some pressure on the OEMs and say, Mr. OEM, you're going to have to prove to us that you're utilizing roughly 10% of the refrigerant that you're putting in equipment in 2023 and 2024 into California. 10% of that is reclaimed refrigerant. So for those of you that aren't real big fans of reclaiming, we know that this is going to get some teeth to it, and we do believe the EPA is going to be doing some things. So if you've not been doing a whole lot of R410A reclaiming in that, which we all should be doing, you might start getting into the practice of doing that, because reclaim is going to become a very important piece of the puzzle.
Hey, Jeff.
And I said, yes.
So we have a question: what is included in self-contained units for PTAX?
What is the refrigerant right now? It would more than likely be R32. So, you know, if you think about a lot of window shakers or window units, where they're manufactured, and that refrigerant will be R32, more than likely. We are starting to see some more and more folks pick on R454B. And once again, because it has a more longevity, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, but that's a good question. Right now, window units, dehumidifiers, if they're coming from other countries, you may start seeing them, a window unit already having R32 in it. So it is an A2L, and I'll explain why they can get away with that right now. Codes and standards are doing it. So it's a real good question. If you deal with commercial refrigeration, like I say, there's some other targets. Once again, if it's January 1st, 2022 in California, 150 GWP limit. So Chemours actually has a refrigerant that has a GWP of less than 150 for, say, medium and low temp refrigeration stuff. So, you know, the reason I show California is only because we do expect that the September EPA information will follow very similar to this. It just may have a slightly modified timeline on that. Now, I talked about the California Air Resource Board of CARB, but this is something called the Climate Alliance, and you can see roughly 24 states have done it. You know, here in the Southeast, really, they've not joined this Climate Alliance, which is probably a good thing, because once the federal takes over, we expect many of these states to stop all the work that they've been doing, because they said, well, in the absence of federal, we got to do something. So that's where the AIM Act is really important, that this will stop a lot of these individual states, because the last thing you'd want to do, especially if you're up, you know, in the northern part of Florida, if you was to work in Alabama or Georgia, or maybe sneak over to Mississippi, the last thing you'd want is a Florida versus Georgia versus Alabama, things being different. We want that federal phase down, federal guidance through that. So we hope that this Climate Alliance is short-lived, but you know, we just got to wait until September and see how these states react for that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about solutions. And so right now, when you talk about the solutions, remember I talked about DuPont or Chemours, that word Freon, you know, R22. So if you talk about air conditioning or maybe medium temp, once again, the Freon, our Freon series, MO99, new 22B, 407C, these are the refrigerants that, you know, I know how expensive R22 is getting, and these become very good choices to retrofit. You know, now these aren't, none of these refrigerants, we recommend none of them to just top off. We recommend that you pull the charge out and weigh in, because if you're just topping off R22 with one of these other 3 refrigerants, you've suddenly become your own chemist and created your own refrigerant. And basically, if something does go wrong, you own that system for the rest of its life. PT charts don't always match up. So these are the solutions for something like R22 in the short term, right? But as we talk about the next generation of refrigerants, and I don't have time to go into a whole lot of detail today, but those of you that like short videos that help educate you on refrigerants, we have a gentleman, Dr. Chuck Allgood. This guy is super smart, but he explains it in such a easy listening method. And his episode 2 was what is an HFO? So these are other terms that tend to get thrown around from time to time. CFC was R12. HCFC was R22. HFCs are things like R410A, 407A, 407C. These things, once again, it's this carbon piece that causes the issue. So as we move forward, you'll hear more and more about something called an HFO or possibly an HFO blend. And this is where Dr. Chuck Allgood does a great job. I think it's maybe a 7-minute video. He's up to episode 30, I think, now. So if you want to know more and more about refrigerant, Dr. Chuck Allgood's presentations are awesome. But here you can see car air conditioners that used to use 134A with a GWP value of 1300, it would actually stay in the atmosphere for roughly 13 years and hold on to that blanket, which is the global warming potential. The heat comes in, but it can't get out of the atmosphere. Versus HFO, what this is all about is, none of us are chemists on this, I doubt, in this meeting, but it's something about a double bonding. Now, you don't have to worry about this double bonding inside the refrigerant, inside the system, and it won't break down. But if it accidentally, and the key is accidentally, gets released into the atmosphere, this double bonding breaks apart the refrigerant molecules very quickly. So you can see car air conditioners over the last handful of years have moved to R1234YF. And with this double bonding, it has a GWP of less than 1. So it's actually better for the environment than something like CO2. It's equivalent to roughly 10 days in the atmosphere. So this is what you're going to be hearing moving forward, is HFOs or HFO blends, because the refrigerant will have this double bonding in there, and that's how we can achieve a much lower GWP value. So as those refrigerants slide out of the way there, you saw R22 and MO99 sliding out of the way. These are the refrigerants of choices moving forward. These green boxes would be interim refrigerants, I would consider them. So let's say you're dealing with maybe commercial refrigeration and you've got a 404 system or maybe a 507 system. The GWP is close to 4,000. By retrofitting with something like XP40, which is our R449A, you've taken it to under 1,300 on the GWP scale. And California, like I say, they've set up things that stores can get credit for doing retrofits for this type of thing. I would expect the EPA and possibly Florida to start looking at things, so Publix or some of the other grocery store chains there in Florida, to say, hey, we really need to get out of this 404 or 507 refrigerant. We'll help you with that by getting down to something, like I say, roughly a third of this, and they'll actually help pay for the retrofits. But these are the green boxes. These are still A1 refrigerants. Now, I haven't used the term A1 yet, but ASHRAE standard 34 is the classification we started talking about. So once again, if you haven't, it's been a while since you took your 608 certification for refrigerant, you probably haven't dealt with ASHRAE standard 34 in a long time. But R22, R410A, even the green boxes that I just showed have a refrigerant classification of A1. So what this is, like I say, ASHRAE standard 34 is an apples to apples comparison. All refrigerants that have an R designation go through this testing. And so what they do is they do a testing to find out its toxicity. It's either lower or higher. So A1 is A, or an A value is lower toxicity. If you dealt with ammonia, that's a B2L, so it's higher toxicity. But all the refrigerants have fallen into this no flame propagation. Now, this is the key. Any refrigerant at a certain temperature will eventually burn, right? So if a house catches on fire and it has R410A system in that house, that R410A will actually burn at some point. But in the apples to apples comparison in ASHRAE standard 34, these refrigerants did not show a flame propagation. So if a bunch of refrigerant was leaked out and there was an ignition source there, that flame or that refrigerant would not ignite. However, if we look at an example of R410A, R410A was introduced to try to get that chlorine out, right, to replace R22. So it's roughly 50% 32 and 50% R125, which is a flame suppressant. That created this like almost perfect balance of trying to get a low GWP without pushing up on the flammability. However, if the goal moving forward is to lower that GWP, what happens is we see that R454B will lower that GWP by roughly 20 or 75%. But now we push down on that GWP thing by going down 75%. But you can see that R32, which is an A2L, and 1234YF, which actually is an A2L as well. So just to let everybody know that the automobile industry, any of your friends that are SAE, or maybe you even hold an SAE certification, the automobile industry's already went through an A2L transition. 1234YF is an A2L. So people talk about flammability. You can imagine releasing 1234YF on a hot exhaust manifold on a car. If that doesn't light something like that because the high temperature of it, then this is what we're trying to understand or explain to everybody, that A2Ls are nowhere near like an A3. Any of you that have been working on commercial refrigeration, maybe some small refrigerators, you can't put more than, I think it's 5.5 ounces or 5.3 ounces of an A2L like R290, sorry, not an A2L, an A3 like R290 or R600, because even the smallest amount of refrigerant and an ignition source will cause a fire, maybe even a slight explosion. You know, you've heard that on your propane grill when you turn the thing on and you keep hitting that sparker and finally it ignites. Well, if you hit it like 4 or 5 times, you hear that little boom inside your gas grill. Well, that's what an A3 is. An A2L is nowhere near that. And that's what I'll help try to explain as we go through this. So you can see we went from Freon. We've got an interim refrigerant that'll help people because some codes and standards aren't in place to get through an interim, but the long-term solution are going to be our Opteon XL series. So all these different refrigerants you see here. And the thing that I think is great is that if you've been in the industry as long as I have, you know, starting out, I had R12, 22, and 502 in my truck. That was it. Through the years, you guys are carrying all kinds of refrigerants. We do believe that when these new refrigerants get released, that you may be down to 3 or 4 refrigerants: XL10, XL41, XL40, and XL20 should be able to cover all your refrigeration and air conditioning needs with the lowest GWP values that are available for those different segments. So you can see there's the XL10, what's in-car air conditioners, less than 1. In the air conditioning segment, there wasn't a green box, right? There is no A1 refrigerant that is capable of replacing R410A. This is where you will see R454B in the very near future being released into some air conditioning products. Okay, so green boxes, great for retrofit. They're non-flammable. So if you ever get an application where somebody wants to do a retrofit, work with Tropic Supply and they'll be able to help you with a retrofit. As we move forward, these Opteon XL series have this 2L designation. That's going to be the long-term solution.
Jeff, we had a quick question that came up. Jerry answered it, but I wanted to announce it to everybody.
Sure.
And they had asked, are these drop-in refrigerants, is flushing required? So Jerry had wrote back that the only drop-in is what's already in the system, and we do have a retrofit guideline at www.freon.com for these refrigerants. I didn't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, he hit it right on the head. So yeah, we've got, like I say, it's a retrofit that we recommend. We don't recommend topping off different refrigerant charges. So we've got the retrofit guidelines. It's a very simple process. In some cases, like I say, MO99 or new 22B, you would not have to change the oil. If you would, that's the downside of 407C, is that you need to try to pull out POE oil out of a reciprocating or a small tin can compressor, and you're not going to do that on a residential application. You may do that on a light commercial that may be semi-hermetic or something. You've got a drain plug for oil, but nope. Gary did exactly. He hit it right on the head. Go to freon.com, and we've got some great retrofit guidelines to walk you through it. Good. All right. So let's talk about, like I say, R410A as we move forward. The retrofit, or not the retrofit, the replacement will be R454B. So why did someone like Carrier, and like I say, we do fully expect to see other OEMs select 454B. The reason is it's so similar. If you've been in the industry for a long time and you went from R22 to 410A, it was higher pressures. It was the introduction of POE oils. You had to buy new gauges and higher pressures. With this transition, it's going to be simpler in the fact that pressures, temperatures, oils, all these things are going to be very similar, especially with 454B. The POE oils we do believe will be similar. R32 might have a slightly different POE oil, but and we'll explain some other reasons why. 454B, like I say, if you've got electronic gauges, you may look and already have 454B as one of your options. If it's not, with electronic gauges, you can do a download and get that into your refrigerant choices. Like I say, if you walked up to a 454B unit versus a 410A, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference in the two units. There might be one or two things that are unique to a A2L piece of equipment versus an A1. That's 454B versus 410A. A lot of the things that you all are doing as far as best practices, they will, when we did R22 to 410A, we kind of went back to the basics, right? We pulled good vacuums. We down to 500 microns. We did a whole lot of things. We pressure tested our line sets, purged with nitrogen whenever we brazed our fittings and stuff. And so this is that, like I say, almost 30 years later, we're going back to the basics again. And, it was a lot of precautions to make sure that 410A was a successful launch. This is what you'll see as we move forward with A2L refrigerants. It will become from recommended to required. But things like workspace ventilation, you should be doing that if you're working with R410A. You should make sure that anytime you're dealing with it, you have good ventilation. Make sure you got the right PPE. And then once again, going to places like Tropic Supply and the equipment that you purchase, make sure that your technicians and installers are trained on how to properly install it. But I will say that many of the tools, like I say, scales, gauges, things like that, will be very similar from R410A to R454B. And so we do believe that you'll see many more OEMs selecting R454B because it has one of the lowest GWP values, which may take us all the way out beyond 2039, right? And it's the closest match to R410A. R32, you may actually see that could actually be an interim refrigerant. And we know that R32 is not exactly like R410A. There's some things that, Daikin has selected R32. They may have to do some more things because of a higher discharge temperature associated with R32. So we do believe that OEMs that select 454B are selecting the longest term, and the most closely matched R410A. So it should make the transition for you as a contractor a simpler one.
We have another question.
Sure.
R22 was green, R410A was pink. What is R454B?
Beautiful gray. And why it's gray, I'll explain. I don't think I've shown a slide here, but moving forward, you'll see almost all refrigerants will come out in a gray cylinder. And you may have actually purchased an R410A cylinder that is actually already gray. Some OEMs, especially maybe imported R410A, may already be in that gray cylinder, because if you think about colors, they really don't mean that much anymore. You know, if all the blues were the same pressures, but you know, if you look at 134A as a light blue, I think MO99 is more R22-ish. That's a dark blue. And then I can't remember, there's another blue, but bottom line, the colors don't mean anything anymore. We just run out of it. So moving forward, Chemours, when we launch a new refrigerant, it will come out more than likely in a gray cylinder, and then the box will highlight all the you know, what it is and everything. And really, that's the key. Is we're supposed to leave the refrigerant cylinders in the box, and I know that's not always easy to do, but moving forward, yeah, the colors, it's a good point. It's going to be gray, but you're probably already seeing that from maybe some of the smaller OEMs have already gone to gray, even for 410A refrigerant. So good question. Good question. I've got a slide, a little more detail about what else will be different on an A2L cylinder. So, but let's spend just a minute on what is different. Like I say, that SNAP Rule 23, I teased about it a little bit earlier. These new A2L refrigerants in a direct system, so you think about a residential split system, it will have to be designed with the latest UL and ASHRAE standard 15. It will not be retrofittable. It will only be in new equipment. And for those of you that only deal with residential applications, ASHRAE standard 15.2 is expected to be released later this year. Basically, it'll make it easier to understand the ASHRAE 15. It gets all the commercial stuff out of the way, and it's only residential. So 15.2 will be residential only. And these newer pieces of equipment will have to follow ASHRAE 15 and UL, the latest editions. So if you go into bigger pieces of equipment, say a chiller or something in a machine room, there may be some additional requirements for ventilation, or maybe you go into a larger piece of equipment. Well, it's all about mitigation. We talk about this mitigation or mitigate. Maybe you've got a rooftop with a new 454B in it. It may say that if I sense any refrigerant leak, I may turn on the blower and maybe open the economizer all the way to introduce fresh air or get more ventilation into the space. You may see some additional labels. This is more for the fire industry, but bottom line is this industry has been working on this change for over 10 years. And so ASHRAE, AHRI, we've educated the NFPA, because once again, to get codes and standards in place for states like Florida, it's important that the NFPA is a part of that. Now, I will say, if you've not looked out on the AHRI website, there's something called the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. And a lot of OEMs, refrigerant manufacturers, and equipment manufacturers are involved in this, but we value you as a contractor's input, and you can actually join these groups. I'm actually on the technician outreach group. We're actually creating a dedicated page just to technicians. So something like this presentation today may be out there very soon, but there's a lot of information to help get you educated on what's going on. And like I say, we've been building information for nearly 10 years to get ready for this transition coming. And this is a perfect example. This is in, I think, the latest edition of the UL. We put together a chart that said, hey, if you were putting in an A1 system, and A1, once again, is that ASHRAE classification like R410A, these were the things that were required or not required. And you can see that when we had first introduced R410A, we're telling you to purge, use nitrogen, evacuate, pressure test. So if you're still doing that, we consider those best practices, right? You know, if you do all these things right for an R410A system, the likelihood of you ever having to go back for a service call because someone didn't pressure test the line sets and it had a leak in it, or they didn't do a good enough evacuation on an existing line set and there was moisture in it. All these things that you're doing as a best practice for an A1, in most cases will become required. Once again, if you went through the R22 to 410A transition, it was basically the OEM said, you got to do it. Unfortunately, things got a little bit slack. So the introduction of the A2Ls, it will be required that you purge with nitrogen. We don't want that carbon in the line sets. Evacuate, pressure test the line sets, right? We want to make sure it's all about that mitigation. We don't want an A2L to be leaked out. And so things that if you're doing best practices already in an A1, an A2L transition is going to be much simpler for you. For the people that are cutting corners and stuff, it's going to be a bigger step for someone like that. And I talked about equipment. So once again, gauges, if you've got R410A, especially if you've got electronic gauges, you'll probably be able to download and incorporate R454B. I will say that, you know, you'll need to get a recovery refrigerant cylinder, and I'll show a slide a little bit on that. But let's say your company has 5 vacuum pumps and 5 recovery machines, right? As you move to replace those over the years, it would be good to make sure that you're moving to a 2L compatible piece of recovery machine or a vacuum pump. Or if you buy a new electronic leak detector, make sure that it says that it's A2L or 2L compatible. You know, you can see scales, ventilation fans. A lot of your tools are going to be very similar. You don't have to do that. But I just did a quick search, and this isn't an exhaustive search. Bottom line is, when you go into Tropic Supply and you're going to buy a new vacuum pump or a new recovery machine, it would be wise to go ahead and buy one that's A2L or 2L compatible. And what you'll find out, once again, it's back to this mitigation. You may find out that these machines have more powerful fans, you know, to circulate air or dilute air. It may be that the when you turn it on, you know, you used to be able to see a little arc when you turned it on. That may be enclosed. So there's just some different things that equipment manufacturers like these have gone through and done their work to say that these new Appions or Yellow Jackets or NAVAC, that these pieces of equipment are ready for A2L refrigerants. So be proactive on the things that you do have to buy. Start working their way in, because these will be backwards compatible to a 410A or an R22 system. So that would be the one thing, advice from this presentation is, as you buy some new stuff, make sure that it's 2L compatible. And someone who asked about the color, great question. Like I say, this will more than likely be what you see an R454B cylinder look like. It may have just a red band, or the whole top of the cylinder may be red. That's going to indicate that it is an A2L refrigerant. It's something different than an A1. Now, if you go in and look at HRI's guideline Q, what they've done is, if you looked at R410A or R22 cylinders, they used to have something called a rupture disc, or they still do. Now, I was fortunate enough in my time in service that I never had a cylinder actually get so high in pressure that that rupture disc let loose. It never happened. I was very fortunate. Being in Florida, I don't know if you guys have ever had that or not. But with an A2L cylinder, instead of a rupture disc saying pressure's too high, just rip open and let all the refrigerant out. The new cylinders will have something called a pressure disc, a resettable pressure disc, that will say if the pressure does get too high, this disc will open. But then once enough refrigerant is released and the pressure is back to something manageable, that will reset. So once again, it's all about this mitigation, that you're trying to manage any of these A2L refrigerants getting out into the atmosphere. Even our cylinders will be working on something like that. So that's what you'll see different. And then when you go to dispose of a disposable cylinder, or what we call a DAC, guideline Q tells you to take a non-sparking tool and poke a hole in it, where I think with R410A it said to take a screwdriver and pull out the rupture disc. So it's slightly different. But bottom line is, almost all refrigerants moving forward, new refrigerants will be in a gray cylinder. If it's an A2L, it'll either have a red band or a red top to it. And then once again, recovery cylinders, you'll look at that as well. You don't want to have R4. You never want to mix refrigerants in a recovery tank, right? Because the reclamation is going to become more and more important. And if you take it in the Tropic Supply and they find out that it's multiple refrigerants, it becomes garbage, you've got to dispose of it, more than likely they'll charge you back, because it's basically a bad refrigerant.
We have a couple more questions.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one, what is the most efficient refrigerant?
I guess it totally depends on the segment or the sector you're in. So when we look at, the air conditioning segment, and that's why we went to that word option, right? It's not just about efficiency, right? You've got to try to balance out the flammability, the price, the operating pressures. So, that's where it becomes a balance, and you can't really just say the most efficient refrigerant, because it may take, some type of extra equipment to make it work in a system. So this is where, the major OEMs look at those choices that SNAP Rule 23 says. You've got roughly 6 choices. And you go through and do your due diligence and test it and say, okay, based on our coils and all this, and we can't make the outdoor unit any bigger, more than likely we can't make the indoor coil any bigger. This is the best balance, or the optimum refrigerant for our choice. And like I say, it looks like R32 versus 454B will be the 2 choices. And, it's a neck and neck race between whether you're talking about COP versus capacity versus efficiency. There's just a whole lot of different things. So tough to answer that one.
Okay, the second question is, how can we use a best practice approach to minimize the use of flame to join lines? Zoom lock and other pressure fittings seem to be a natural solution.
I think I might be able to answer that in just a couple slides and talk about things called LFL and some different things. So hopefully, if I can hold off answering that question, I've got a slide that I think I can better answer that question in a minute.
Okay, and then someone else said all tanks are going to be gray. That's correct.
Yes, correct.
And then the other one is, what is the drop-in for R22 refrigerant?
A drop-in. So once again, it comes back to what's the application. If it's air conditioning, there are several different choices, right? MO99, new 22B. If you can change the POE oil, 407C is a good choice. If it's R22 refrigeration, then there's some other choices in that. But that's something that coming in the Tropic Supply, and we've got a really good chart. Chemours has got a really good chart that will walk you through that, depending on what, with R22, what are you doing with it? Is it comfort cooling? Is it refrigeration based? But there's some good refrigerants that are as close to a drop-in as possible. Depends if you want to play with the oil or not, and that's where it comes into play. So some good choices. It really just depends on your application. It's not a one refrigerant. It's not the one refrigerant fits all, unfortunately. Okay.
Okay. And then I see that 2 people have their hand raised. If you go ahead and type in the chat feature, whatever your question is, be happy to get it answered. And then one more just came through. So CO2 is 1/3 of the energy of R410A. R22 was 30% more efficient than R410A. where do you see the new refrigerants landing?
If we're talking about 410A, then I would say that the R454B is the closest match to that from an operating pressure, from a performance efficiency wise. It's a good balance, like I say. CO2. Yeah, that one's a little tougher to try to answer just because, once again, I mean, don't get me wrong, CO2 is never going to go away. Ammonia is never going to go away, but they're never going to replace all these other refrigerants either. It's just there's different segments and different applications for different refrigerants. And CO2 has its place in different areas. A little more of a challenge maybe in Florida. You have to get very creative in the structure to do that. Ammonia, once again, it has its place, but yeah, I think depending on the segment, that's where if you looked at all the choices that we have, R410A in an air conditioning application, R454B is a great choice because it's one of the best balances of system design, very similar, a little bit higher in efficiency, but once again, you start talking about that, then you may give up a little bit of capacity or COP. There's just a whole lot of different levers to deal with. So yeah, hopefully I answered that. CO2 is a wild card, at least for my presentation. It doesn't fit in a whole lot of applications here in the residential or light commercial area, but good question. So.
And then we had one more say, what did you say the programming needed to be on the new gauges? And Jerry wrote back and said, if you have electronic gauges, then you need the latest update to include the new refrigerants.
Yes, very good. Yep. So if you've got electronic, yeah, it's easy download. And 454B and R32 would be in there. So good questions.
We're caught up on questions.
Excellent. So once again, if you think back to the R22 to 410A days, right? There was a lot of myths going on out there. Oh my gosh, 50% higher pressure. You know, it's going to be a bomb. My truck's going to explode. POE oils, it's so dry. There's a whole lot of things. And early on with these A2L refrigerants, there was this concern that I'm going to have to spend tens of thousands of dollars to redesign my truck to handle an A2L refrigerant. Well, once again, our industry has been working for 10 years for things like with the DOT. And as a contractor, we feel like it's going to be service, it's going to be under a service vehicle, it's going to be something under we call the materials of trade. You're already handling acetylene tanks or oxygen tanks, right? So it's basically going to be business as usual. We would like to see the cylinders in the upright position, but we wanted that with our 410A as well, because that rupture disc works much better if it's under a vapor and not a liquid refrigerant. So, you know, we've worked with the DOT. My son's a truck driver, and, you know, he's like, Dad, it's either flammable or non-flammable. And what we've been able to do is explain that these new A2L refrigerants, there's another area in between there. We've been able to do it with the fire department, with DOT, with OSHA. It's been a long process, but we've been able to educate each one of them. And that's why you guys are getting this right now, is we're helping educate you before the equipment comes out to say that if you dealt with A3s, you know how flammable R290 and R600 is. But these A2Ls are much more like an A1 refrigerant like R410A. So hopefully that's our job, is to try to work with all the different industries and help explain these different refrigerants. So this is the slide that I wanted to get to. And like I say, we're getting close on time, but there's been some really good questions. This is where I wanted to make sure that everybody understands the difference between an A3, which even the smallest spark, like I say, with your gas grill, will ignite R290. That's why you only see roughly 5.3 ounces in any R290 system. This is what you need for a flame. You need the right amount of air. You need the right amount of fuel, or in this case, refrigerant, and you need the right ignition. So I'm a big car guy, right? So you need air introduced into the cylinder, you bring gas in, and you have the spark plug do its thing, you get ignition, right? So the difference between an A2L and an A3 is a lot of difference. So what you'll find out is A2Ls are less likely to ever get to that flammable concentration. So someone asked about what's in a window unit already. So if it's coming over from overseas, it's more than likely got R32 in it. Even if somebody took a screwdriver and poked a hole in that unit and it's R32 and it all leaked out into the room at once, and there was an ignition source, the refrigerant would never get to this concentration of the right amount of air, the right amount of refrigerant, and the ignition. So all that A2L refrigerant or R32 could be leaked out into the room, and it would never get to that right concentration because you'd have too much air, not enough refrigerant. Even if there was an ignition source, a flame would not occur. So what we're trying to say is A2Ls are less likely to ever form that concentration. But you may see in some equipment manufacturers, you may see them trying to reduce the refrigerant charge. You might start seeing people utilize more microchannel, because microchannel, you can reduce the charge by as much as 40% in a system. So if a split system had 6 pounds and you use microchannel on some of the coils, you might be able to get that down to 4 pounds. If all 4 pounds of an A2L leaked out into a room in a house, even if there was an ignition source, it wouldn't be enough of that concentration, this nice little triangle in here, to ever light that refrigerant. And like I said, with R290, just that simple spark can light that. A2Ls, if it gets to the right concentration, it's much harder to ignite. Things like even heat pumps with electric heaters, we bypassed the overload and let those heaters get cherry red, introduced refrigerant and the air in there, and even with something like an electric heating element with the overload bypassed, did not ignite that A2L. So it's much safer to use. Now, let's say that everything falls into place. We got the right air, we got the right refrigerant, and we have a strong enough ignition source. We've got some videos, and once again, we've worked very hard with the fire department. So UL's done a lot of testing to help the fire department to sign off and say, yes, we understand how an A2L is going to act in a fire or something like that. So if you've lit off too much propane in your gas grill, if it took a while for that igniter, you get this explosion, right? If you get the right concentration with an A2L, it's almost like a Bic lighter. It's a very lazy flame that would be there. And in some cases, if the ignition source goes away, the refrigerant will self-extinguish, right? It's not self-propagating it. And in a lot of cases, an A2L can't stay lit if there's no continuous ignition source. So that's where we're saying that even if there is something that does get into that condition, but it's all about mitigation, I guarantee Root or Ream or Carriers of the world will not want to have a piece of equipment out there that can do it. So I'll talk about the mitigation. Like I say, I know we're getting really close on time. You guys hang in there with me. This is some reports that, once again, 10 years of industry research. You can see all the different things that even if it's the right concentration, these things don't have a strong enough ignition source to light an A2L and air. All right, so bear with me. Changes, how they're going to take place. So this is what's interesting, is that in the state of Florida, they've already started this. The state of Washington and the state of Florida have adopted the latest UL 2-40 and the latest ASHRAE standard 15. So technically, if Root or Ream would introduce an A2L piece of equipment, it could possibly get installed in Florida. But you guys know, depending on where you're at, different model codes, whether it's, IMC or UMC, depending on what, your state or maybe even your local codes adopt, there's still some things that need to go through. And that's where we see it probably 2023 or 2024 is the most likely time frame that some of this A2Ls will go out. But if you're dealing with window units, PTEX, they already have that. So there's some areas, like I say, the state of California or state of Florida, like I say, did adopt these. They've got to work their way down. And like I say, you guys know your local codes much better than I do. And so just be aware that if you see ASHRAE standard 15-2019, that means A2Ls could actually be used in your area. All right, almost to the end. Like I say, window units, PTACs, all these cars. So the ASE certified guys have already went through A2L training and understand what's the, the safeguards that you need to do. Here's the part that I think you'll see, and this is just Chemours' guess, right? This is us reading UL 2-40, saying what's going to look different on an A2L piece of equipment. So you may see something like the contactor might be an enclosed contactor, or maybe the whole control box will be more sealed. There won't be as many holes in it, because let's say if the right concentration got out there, the right air and the right refrigerant got there, if the control box is sealed up, then you don't have an ignition source. You need those three things. There'll be other ways to prevent external ignitions. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Something as simple as turning on the blower on your furnace or fan coil will dilute that refrigerant concentration to where it never gets to that flammable concentration. And then I talked about this, smaller charges. If all of it leaks out at once, it's still not enough refrigerant in that space to ever get to that lower flammability limit. I haven't used that term very much, but LFL is a lower flammability limit. And like I say, this is where I'd say, there will be a portion that Root or Ream or the carriers of the world will say, Mr. Contractor, we need your help to make sure it's a good installation. And that's back to the pressure testing and making sure the room sizes, that they'll go into more detail about that. But you will more than likely see a refrigerant sensor that will be factory installed, more than likely somewhere on the coils. And it says, even if I sniff 25% of that LFL, which means LFL is that lower flammability limit, even if I sniff only 25% of that, take action. It could be just turning on the blower. If it's a larger piece of equipment, it could be turning on the blower, open up your economizer. It could say, turn on the blower, shut off a solenoid, don't allow any more refrigerant to come in that space. There's a lot of different ways that each OEM is going to look at it. And that's where, once a product is released, you'll have to get some training. All right. Bear with me the last couple seconds here.
Yeah.
Product quality, I can't hit this enough, whether it's existing refrigerants or new refrigerants. We are getting more and more service calls on, I can't figure out what's going on. It says it's got R22 in the system, but I can't match anything up to pressure and temperature chart. We actually did some independent testing, and cylinder that was supposed to have 134A, in this case had 13%, but it had almost 86% of a hydrocarbon. So back to an R290, you could actually be putting 134A into a system, but if it's something that's bought off the internet or maybe purchased from an import, is it really 134A? So we're finding that a lot of these smaller OEMs aren't following the AHRI 700 standards. This could possibly be a flammable, more like an A3 flammable refrigerant. And then you guys know, one of the worst things in a system is a non-condensable, if it's got air in it. This other one, 27% was really 134A, but 72%, the refrigerant analyzer couldn't even identify what it was. So what we're finding out is, especially guys are saying, man, I've gone out on this system, it's got high head pressure, I can't figure out how to clean the coil 3 times. I think it must have a restriction in the coil. So, guys are getting ready to do drastic things like change a coil out or do something like that. And what we found is we're like, hey guys, if you're not the one that put that refrigerant in, pull out that refrigerant, weigh in a quality refrigerant, and if you still have the problem, call us back. And a lot of times we don't get that call back. So we're getting a lot of refrigerants out there that for 50 cents less a pound, come on, it's 25 pounds, 50 cents less a pound, it's not worth buying a refrigerant that you don't know that they're following these standards. Moisture content, or worse, think about an expansion valve freezing up. Non-condensables I talked about. How many times have you ever torn apart a TXV and got black gunk, or maybe a reversing valve had that black gunk. Maybe that manufacturer didn't clean their cylinders and that had a rust inhibitor inside of it, and they just poured in the refrigerant. If they're not following AHRI 700 standards, you're just introducing a problem that none of you guys need. You understand how a refrigeration system works, and if you get some kind of funky refrigerant in there that's either got residue or moisture or non-condensables, maybe it's not even the right composition, you're just introducing something that it's going to be a very hard thing to chase. So bottom line is, make sure that when you go to Tropic Supply, they've got a refrigerant that is known and trusted. Don't buy stuff off the internet or worse. So if you want to know how to test, we actually have on our cylinders, we actually have a little barcode. Yeah, sure.
We have a couple questions. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right,
No
so
worries.
one is how to add refrigerant liquid and vapor. That was from a little bit ago, so I don't know if that's.
So yeah, any blended refrigerant, we're going to recommend that it comes out in a liquid out of the cylinder. So now, you could maybe just crack your gauges, or you can actually buy, I think it's called a charge rater, which basically it's coming out of the cylinder in liquid form, but then that charge rater is like a little piston, and it turns it into vapor going into the system. So as long as it comes out of the cylinder in liquid form, that's going to be the key. MO99, any of these refrigerants that are a blend, it's recommended to come out of the cylinder in liquid form, which more than likely means turn the jug upside down.
Okay, and then someone else said that they must have missed something, that R32 is more flammable than R410A. And Jerry wrote that it's R32 is an A2L mildly flammable.
Yes, so it is A2L. It is mildly flammable, but R454B actually has roughly 70% of R32 in it. So I would say that more flammable, no. I mean, A2L is an A2L. There's a range. And so, to say that we selected 454B because it was less flammable than 32, I would not say that. It's more, an A3 is highly flammable, but anything that's in an A2L bucket of ASHRAE, apples to apples comparison, I don't think that you could say, one's more flammable than the other. It's such a small difference. It might be 1% difference or 2% difference in that area. So good question. Yep.
And the last one is, how will the new residential units be labeled? Like a current, I think it's Puron label.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, so on the rating plate, somewhere, you get into the details. If you get on a rating plate, it will say R410A and say how many pounds of refrigerant in it. This would probably say R454B or possibly R32. A OEM like Carrier, I know that they've announced theirs is Puron Advance. So that Puron name got a lot of traction. It was R410A, but they labeled it Puron. I see Tropic Supply, strong Rude and Ream. Rude or Ream may come out and have their trade name, but bottom line, as a contractor, as a service person, it's either more likely going to be R454B or possibly R32.
Okay, and I just had one more come through. Do you know if Copeland has picked one refrigerant over the other?
No, they have not. No, I mean, like I say, R32 has its advantages because it's a pure refrigerant, right? But it has higher discharge temperatures. So, but like I say, if you talk to anyone and start talking long enough term, even Europe and Asia, where all these air conditioners are being put in with R32, they recognize that that is an interim refrigerant, and that you will see Europe and others going to something like R454B, trying to get under 500 GWP. We believe that's the next target, to get under 500 GWP. So that's where, like I say, the GWP value, that's what it's all about moving forward.
All right.
True or false? Global warming potential is going to play an important part in future refrigerant selections. Good. Man, that's quick fingers, man. All
Yes.
right. Okay. Now, question 2 is multiple choice, so don't have your finger on a T or an F. So, all right, multiple choice. What does the 2L class mean? Remember, ASHRAE standard 34. Is it highly flammable, flammable, lower flammability, or lower toxicity? All right, so it was worth hanging on a few extra minutes. Apologize, we went over an hour, but all right. Question 3 is also multiple choice, so get ready. Which of the following system types currently utilize A2L refrigerants? Is it car air conditioners, window air conditioners, PTACs, or all of the above? All right, so you ready for the last question?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, once again, multiple choice. Which of the following is an A2L refrigerant? Is it R454B, R290, R410A, or R600A? Okay. All right, so yep, there's the answers. Very good. All right. Well, like I say, I want to thank Tropic Supply for allowing me to present today. There's a couple email addresses shown here. This is my email address. Dr. Chuck Allgood, if you get out there, the checkup with Dr. Chuck, or if you call Chemours Tech to Tech line or Tech to Tech email address, that goes to Jamie Hale. And then finally, if you want to know more about A2Ls, stay up to date on them, we actually have a newsletter. And you can go out to our opteon.com website and sign up for an A2L newsletter. So that's all I have.